Inside the corridors of the Iranian leadership, in the rooms where decisions are actually made, there is a conversation happening right now that the state media is not broadcasting. It is a conversation about money and about time and about the specific question of how long the current arrangement of power inside Tehran can survive what is being done to it from the outside. I want to take you into that conversation because the public face of this crisis, the missile strikes and the freighters and the diplomatic statements, is only the surface. The real story is what is happening inside a regime that built its entire structure on the assumption that its oil revenue would continue to flow forever and is now watching that assumption collapse in real time. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not a normal state. It is a fusion of three overlapping institutions. There is the formal clerical structure, headed by what they call the Supreme Leader, supported by an assembly of senior religious figures and a network of theological seminaries that supplies the personnel for the upper layer. There is the political apparatus, with a presidency, a parliament, and a judiciary that performs the function of a government for international purposes, but exercises only limited independent authority. And then there is the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the parallel military and economic empire that controls a significant portion of the country's industrial base, much of its illicit commerce, and effectively all of its external power projection. These three institutions are not separate. They overlap. The same families circulate through all three. The same financial networks feed all three. But the balance of power between them shifts depending on how much money is in the system. And right now, the money is being squeezed at a rate the regime has never experienced. The naval blockade enforced by the United States over Iranian ports is currently estimated to be costing the regime around $500 million per day in lost oil revenue. To understand what that figure means inside the system, you have to think about who that money was paying. It was paying the senior officers of the Revolutionary Guard. It was paying the militias the regime sponsors in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria. It was paying the network of front companies and shell entities that move the money around the sanctions regime. It was paying the patronage that holds the entire structure together. When that money stops flowing, the patronage starts breaking down. The militias start asking when they will be paid. The officers start asking whether the political leadership has any plan beyond hoping the Americans will lose interest. The shell company operators start looking for new patrons, and the conversation inside the regime starts to change. This is the same dynamic that has preceded the collapse of every authoritarian regime in modern history. The center cannot pay the periphery. The periphery loses faith in the center. The center loses control of the periphery. And then suddenly the center loses control of the country. The freighter that was struck in the Gulf of Oman this morning is one piece of evidence in this larger picture. It is the fifth such vessel disabled since the blockade began, with more than 100 others turned back without ever attempting to challenge the blockade physically. Each one of those interceptions is a transaction the regime did not get to complete. Each completed interception is revenue removed from the system. And inside the system, that removal is felt unevenly. The senior figures, the ones with foreign accounts, the ones with families in Europe and North America, they have buffers. They have hidden assets. They can absorb the shock. The middle layer cannot. The colonels and the brigadiers and the regional commanders who depend on the patronage flow for their own incomes and the incomes of the men below them, they feel the shock immediately. And historically, when an authoritarian regime cracks, it does not crack at the top. It cracks in the middle. The senior leadership remains intact for a long time, but the colonels stop following orders. The local commanders make their own arrangements. The security forces begin to negotiate with one another instead of executing the directives of the leadership. There is a name that has emerged in the last several months that I want you to know, because it is a name that is going to matter in the months ahead. Mojtaba Khamenei. He is the son of the previous supreme leader, and he has been increasingly positioned as the claimed successor in the wake of recent events. The fact that he is being put forward at all is itself a signal of how the regime is improvising. The Iranian supreme leader is, in theory, selected by an assembly of clerics after deliberation. The fact that succession is being managed in the open, by family connection rather than by institutional process, tells you the institutions are not functioning normally. The senior clerics who would normally drive that process are either dead or sidelined, or unwilling to take responsibility for the choice in the current circumstances. The decision is being made by a smaller circle, and the candidate is being selected for the convenience of that circle rather than for the formal qualifications the role traditionally requires. That is a dynastic move in a system that was built specifically to prevent dynasties from forming. It is an admission of institutional failure even as it tries to project institutional continuity. The figure most publicly serving as the voice of this new arrangement, Mohsen Rezai, a longtime advisor and military veteran, has been issuing statements that read less like the confident pronouncements of a stable regime and more like the defensive arguments of a leadership that is losing its narrative. He recently accused the United States of betraying diplomacy. He framed the blockade as an act of aggression. He demanded that Washington return to the negotiating table on Iran's terms. None of this is the language of a regime that thinks it is winning. This is the language of a regime that is being slowly squeezed and is trying to get the international community to feel sympathy for that squeeze. It is not working. And it is not working because there is no constituency outside Iran that is willing to spend political capital to relieve the pressure. The Europeans are silent. The Russians are distracted by their own front in Ukraine. The Chinese are calculating their long-term position and are not willing to commit to anything that would put their own interests at risk. The Pakistanis, who have been quietly supporting the Iranian regime by allowing freight to depart from their ports for Iranian destinations, are now being publicly identified as a transit node and are facing their own diplomatic costs. The regime is alone in a way it has not been alone in decades, and the population, the 90 million people who live inside the country and who have been telegraphing for years that they do not support the regime, are watching all of this happen. They are not naive. They understand that the blockade is causing economic damage in the short term. They also understand that the alternative, an indefinite continuation of the current regime, is worse. They have lived through the Green Movement of 2009, when massive protests against electoral fraud were suppressed by the security forces. They have lived through the protests of 2017 and 18 over economic conditions. They have lived through the protests that followed the death of a young woman in the custody of the morality police in 2022. Each of those waves of protest has demonstrated that the regime is sitting on a population that does not consent to be ruled by it. The protests have already begun again. The strikes in key industrial sectors have already begun. The conversations in the markets and the universities and the religious schools have already begun. The regime knows this. It is responding the way authoritarian regimes always respond when they feel internal pressure compounding with external pressure. It is increasing surveillance. It is increasing detentions. It is positioning the security forces. It is preparing for a moment where it may have to use force against its own population on a scale it has not used in years. But the security forces themselves are not monolithic. The regular military, the army, the air force, the navy has historically had a tense relationship with the Revolutionary Guard. The regular military is broadly Iranian in its loyalty. The Guard is broadly regime in its loyalty. When the crunch comes, the question is whether the regular military will be willing to fire on Iranian civilians on behalf of a regime that has been bleeding the country dry for 40 years. There is no certainty about that answer. The regime is not certain about that answer either. That uncertainty is part of what is driving the diplomatic posture we are seeing in the last 72 hours. Reports indicate the regime has now committed in principle to neither developing nor acquiring nuclear weapons. That is a significant concession by historical standards. The Iranian nuclear program has been a central component of the regime's strategic doctrine for nearly 2 decades. To set it aside, even in principle, even with the expectation that the commitment may be revisited later, is to acknowledge that the current pressure is producing concessions the regime would never have considered in less constrained circumstances. The strike on the American airbase in Kuwait, the launch of a short-range ballistic missile by Iranian regular forces against a logistics hub of the United States Air Force in the region, has to be read in this context. It was not a strike that was expected to succeed in any meaningful military sense. It was a domestic signal. It was a message to the Iranian population, and more specifically to the security services that surround the regime, that the leadership is still willing to take risks, still willing to act, still willing to defy. It was a performance of resolve, not a serious military operation. The fact that the missile was intercepted, that the only casualties were debris injuries, that the only equipment loss was a single drone, confirms that the operation was symbolic rather than substantive. But the symbolism itself reveals something. The regime is now putting its own people, its own forces, in the line of American response in order to keep its domestic narrative alive. That is not strength. That is a regime that has run out of less risky options. And the security services watching that operation, knowing how it was likely to go, are drawing their own conclusions about the leadership's judgment. There is one more dimension to this that I want to make sure you understand before I close. The succession question. Whether the figure currently being positioned as the new supreme leader actually consolidates power, whether the senior clerics ratify the arrangement, whether the Revolutionary Guard accepts the transition, whether the regular military stays neutral, these are open questions. And inside the regime, there are factions positioning themselves for what comes next. There are figures inside the Revolutionary Guard who believe the current trajectory is unsustainable and who are quietly preparing for a moment in which they will need to act, either in coordination with the new leadership or in opposition to it. There are figures inside the clerical establishment who are uncomfortable with the way succession is being managed and who are uncomfortable with the strategic decisions that have led to the current crisis. There are figures inside the political apparatus who would prefer a more accommodating posture toward the international community. None of these factions controls the situation. But the existence of these factions, the visible tension among them, is itself a sign that the regime is no longer operating as a single coordinated entity. When external pressure compounds, internal divisions widen. When internal divisions widen, the regime loses the ability to respond coherently to that external pressure. That is the loop, and the loop, once it starts, becomes very difficult to interrupt. We have seen this loop in other authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. We saw it in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. We saw it in the various Arab states during the regional uprisings of the early 2010s. We saw it in Venezuela across multiple cycles of crisis. The loop has a pattern. The pattern is recognizable. And the regime in Tehran is now well inside it. There is one element of the internal Iranian situation that I want to add, because Western coverage routinely underweights it. The women's movement inside Iran has been one of the most sustained, most courageous, most organized civil opposition movements of the past decade. The protests that followed the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022 were not just protests about a single incident. They were the visible surface of a much deeper civic transformation that has been underway inside Iranian society for years. The educational achievement of Iranian women now exceeds that of Iranian men in most fields. The professional ambitions of Iranian women have grown to a point where the regime's enforcement of mandatory dress codes is no longer culturally enforceable. The willingness of Iranian women to defy those codes in public, knowing the personal risks involved, is one of the most striking phenomena in any contemporary authoritarian society. When the regime faces the kind of compounding pressure it is now facing, the women's movement is one of the actors that is going to be in the streets first and in the largest numbers. That is something the regime understands. It is also something the regime has not figured out how to suppress without producing exactly the kind of international response that further isolates it. There is also a regional dimension to the question of regime continuity that the Iranian leadership has to consider. The proxy networks the regime has built across the region depend on Iranian patronage. The militias in Lebanon, the militias in Iraq, the militias in Yemen, the networks in Syria. Each of these is staffed by people who have been paid by Tehran for years, sometimes decades. When the patronage stops, the relationships become transactional. Some of those proxies will simply collapse without Iranian support. Others will try to find new patrons. Some will turn on their former handlers in exchange for amnesty or accommodation from local governments. The Iranian regional position is built on a network that runs on cash. The blockade is cutting the cash. The network is going to start coming apart, and as it comes apart, the regime's regional posture, which was supposed to be a strategic asset, becomes a strategic liability. Local governments that have tolerated Iranian-backed proxies because they could not safely confront them are now going to start dismantling those proxies, knowing that the patron cannot reinforce them. This is happening already in some theaters. It will accelerate. Whether the loop produces a managed transition, a negotiated outcome, an internal coup, or a popular uprising is impossible to predict in advance. What is possible to predict is that the loop, once started, does not reverse without a fundamental change in the inputs. The inputs of the blockade, the diplomatic isolation, the economic damage, the loss of patronage, and the visible weakness of the leadership. As long as those inputs continue at their current intensity, the loop continues. The regime can only change the inputs by changing its own behavior. Accepting a deal would change the inputs. Continuing to escalate would change the inputs, but in the wrong direction. Waiting for the United States to lose interest is not a strategy that has any historical evidence of success. The freighter drifting in the Gulf of Oman, the missile intercepted over Kuwait, the rhetoric coming out of Tehran, the protests in the streets, the meetings happening behind closed doors, all of these are facets of the same story. The story is that a regime that has held power for nearly half a century is now facing the convergence of external enforcement and internal dissent in a way it has never faced before. Whether the regime survives that convergence is no longer a foregone conclusion. The men in the corridors know it. The conversation has already started, and the outcome of that conversation, more than the outcome of any military operation, will determine what comes next for the country, for the region, and for the wider international order that has been wrestling with this regime for 45 years. The clock is running. The conversation is happening, and the world is watching the surface of a story whose real action is taking place far from the cameras.